Hi, folks, and welcome. I can see our attendees are filling in. So we're going to hang out for a second while our Zoom room fills up with folks. Make yourself at home. Welcome. If you are looking for a discussion on a 1952 double murder at Crater Lake in Oregon, you're in the right place. If you are not here to talk about a double murder at Crater Lake, please stay. It'll be really interesting. They're still coming in. Welcome, everyone. As I'll do my spiel as the rest of our guests file in today. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us at Alta Live. This is a digital event series for Alta Journal. We're a quarterly magazine focused on California and the West, obviously including Oregon. I'm Beth Spotswood. I'm Alta's digital editor. Today, I am happy to welcome writer Julian Smith. He's an Oregon-based award-winning author, and we're delighted to have him as an Alta contributor. He's here along with journalist and true crime writer Eve Batey. Eve is a founding editor of SFist, former deputy managing editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. She's writing for SF Eater now, but relevant to our interest today, she publishes a true crime newsletter called Best Evidence. In the latest issue of Alta, Julian recounts a vicious 1952 double murder at Crater Lake that stunned the nation. The FBI and the Oregon State Police were unable to solve this, but 26 years ago, the granddaughter of one of the victims picked up the case. I've roped in Eve, an expert on the phenomenon of true crime enthusiasm, to kind of chime in here with a discussion. We're going to get into the details of the case, discuss the possible suspects, I have my picks, and explore some of the mysteries of Crater Lake, which the more I learn, the weirder I realize that it is. I'm going to speak with Julian and Eve for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to take as many of your questions as we can. Please use the question button below to submit a question for any one of our guests. This interview will be recorded and posted on altaonline.com later today. If you're here, you've registered with an email. So I will shoot you an email with the link to this event, links to Julian's articles, anything else we talk about today, Eve's newsletter, funky mysteries around Crater Lake. So expect that email. Also, please, always check out Alta and Alta Online. And without further ado, we have lots to talk about. So I wanna dive right in, if I may. Julian, I hate to put you on the spot, but as briefly as possible, can you tell us what happened on July 19th, 1952 at Crater Lake?
Yeah, so there were two carloads of local guys that were going to meet up at the lake. One car showed up earlier and the other car came in a few hours later, and they found the first car sitting at a pull-off empty, and their friends were gone. So they looked around a little bit. They couldn't find him. They got the Rangers to look for him. They couldn't find him. And a few days later, they found both their bodies in the woods, and they had been clearly murdered. They'd been shot in the head, gagged up. There was all kinds of weird things about the crime scene. Their shoes were taken off. Their money was gone, and they were gagged with one of the guy's shirts. There was all kinds of weird stuff about the crime scene. And that set off one of the biggest investigations in the history of the Pacific Northwest. It involved the local police, the state police, the FBI, because it was a national park. And they looked and looked and looked and never really pinned it on anybody, and eventually just kind of gave up.
What attracted you to this case in the first place? Your previous work for us has been a look at a Buster Keaton filming a movie in a small Oregon town, and your book, which I will just give a little props to Julian here, has recently been optioned by Disney to be made into a movie, is about Aloha rodeo cowboys. So what attracted you to, are you a true crime buff? What attracted you to this case?
Well, yeah, this is really the first crime story I've ever done. I mean, I love reading about it and, listening to podcasts. I've even turned my two girls on to listening to stuff like Criminal in the car. They're always fascinating stories. But this one actually kind of fell into my lap. Another writer was in touch with the two main folks in the case, Alice and Dave. Alice, whose grandfather was killed, and Dave, who she's been working with to try and solve the case. He was the son of one of the state policemen who was investigating it. And so a few years ago, I just got an email out of the blue from another writer I know saying, these folks have come to me asking if I want to look into the story, and I don't really have the bandwidth for it. Do you want to take it on? I said, yeah, of course, I'd love to. And yeah, things just rolled from there. It was great to have both of them involved, Alice and Dave. They were incredibly forthcoming about everything that they'd done. They'd done a ton of research over the past couple decades. And their reason behind it, not just to solve the case, but they wanted to get the story out there more, because Alice is pretty convinced that, as they say in X-Files, the truth is out there, and all it takes is the right person to come across the story and say, oh yeah, my uncle was talking about that, when I was a kid. So they're hoping the more publicity the story gets, the closer they can get to finding who did it, for sure.
And we should clarify for those that haven't read the article yet, although you will, because it's like incredibly interesting. Alice is the granddaughter of one of the men who was shot at Crater Lake. And 26 years ago, she was a baby. She was 1 year old when her grandfather was shot. But 26 years ago, she started in earnest trying to find out what had happened to her grandfather. Dave Bergman is the son of an Oregon State police officer who had grown up hearing about this case. And so the two of them, along with kind of a fascinating cast of characters who've gotten involved in this case, have spent, the past few years, if not decades, trying to explore the many twists and turns of this case. So I'm going to jump over to you, Eve. You've done a little bit of research on that. You've read Julian's article, and we've kind of been the three of us talking about extended research about this case and how weird and interesting it is. What are some of your takeaways?
Well, I think that one of the things to remember when we're talking about cases like this is that the most difficult cases to solve are cases where you have a large transient population, by which I mean everything from truck stops along 80 to national parks to, we keep talking about how this car was found at a pull-off. Think about the number of people who drive by a pull-off that, we see all the time on Highway 1, say, or something like that. So I understand like Mrs. Sims' frustration with the investigation, but I keep going back to the fact that this is a place that so many people were passing through and driving. It's not like it happened in the town square.
See, this is my first and, introduction to Crater Lake. And as I read Julian's article with great interest. I also have to give a shout out to the artist who did the artwork for this story, Mark Smith. Very cool artwork, very spooky artwork in this. So please check it out online, or you can buy a real copy on our website. But can you just, for those of us that don't know Crater Lake at all, I was just asking, is Lake Tahoe an appropriate equivalent? Is it more? It's a national park. A city park.
Is it a national park, Julian, or is it like a state park? I'm not actually sure.
It's a national park. Yeah.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's kind of comparable to Tahoe in that it's gorgeous. It's a stunning blue lake surrounded by mountains. It's smaller. It's round because it's a volcano. And the main difference besides the size is that Tahoe is surrounded by cities and towns, and there's boats zooming across it. And Crater Lake is kind of in the middle of nowhere. There's a national park lodge there, and that's it. So it's just beautiful, serene, empty. And that gives it a kind of almost weird vibe to it. And, you start looking into this, and there's a lot of not just murders and weird things, but UFO stories about Crater Lake. It's supposed to be one of the hot spots for that in the West. And you can kind of see it. It's a real interesting mix of just stunning scenery, and it's so unique that you can see how people make the connection. Like you could see the spaceship from Close Encounters just coming down over this lake and beaming up a tour boat full of people.
There are also Bigfoot rumors at Crater Lake.
Yes. Yeah.
Eve really disagrees. If she's believing in Bigfoot, it's definitely in California. But before we dive into kind of the other weird mysteries of Crater Lake, which I do want to get into, there are a number of elements of this particular story that the story takes us on a journey. It curves it goes down to California. There is a number of elements for those of us who kind of follow deep into this story that I think are weird. And so I'm going to share what I think are the weirdest elements of this story and ask you what you guys think. Okay. First, they had, the two gentlemen that were murdered had $300. They had watches, wallets, and $300 in cash, which is apparently $3,000 in present day money. Why, if you're going fishing, would you have $3,000 in cash? Why were they wearing business suits for an afternoon of fishing and sightseeing? Although it did occur to me this happened at 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Maybe they did a morning of work. That it appears that from the time that their abandoned car or open car was discovered to the time the medical examiner estimates that they were murdered was 3 hours. What happened? They were found a half a mile away from the car. What happened in those 3 hours? That's a long time to rob someone and shoot them. I think. I've never done it. There was one of the victim's credit cards was used as a California gas station, and everyone's kind of like, oh, that's weird. But it didn't seem like, I mean, that seems like the strongest lead to me. While they were in the 48 hours they were searching for the 2 bodies, a lady received a weird phone call asking for access to one of the victim's cars. And then there's a gang called the Mountain Murder Mob that's going around the West Coast killing people that could be potentially tied into this. So from yes, we will be sending a recording after the event, Bonnie. So from this, what looks to me like a robbery gone wrong, like 2 guys in a fancy car in suits, has a lot of really odd elements.
You didn't mention my favorite odd element, which is the dentures in the pockets.
Yeah. Yeah.
Remind me of the dentures in the pockets.
Julian?
When they found the bodies, like we were talking about before, there was a lot of weird things about the crime scene. Their shoes were gone, but their socks, actually one of the guy's pairs of shoes was gone. The other guy's pairs of shoes was still there, but they had their shoes off. Their socks were clean though, so they must have taken them off right there for some reason. They had their dentures in their pockets. One of the guys had apparently taken off his undershirt, put his shirt back on, and then the killers tore the undershirt in half and made gags out of it. So because the guys were gagged, they were beaten up really badly. And I mean, that's just the beginning of the weird twists. And then all the twists that happen when Alice and Dave start looking into the case, things go even weirder.
Do you think that the FBI and the Oregon State Police did, as we look at it from 2021 through our 2021 glasses, I feel like they screwed up the crime scene and all of the evidence. And but at the time, was the best of the best working on this case, the Oregon State Police and the FBI? Were they utilizing all of the tools at their command?
Eve, you probably have more experience on this. I mean, it sounds like they did what looked like a thorough job, but also missed a lot of connections and didn't follow up leads. What do you think, Eve?
It seems like because I feel like there's this third agency too, right? Like, I don't know how Park Police was involved, but typically when there's a homicide that's committed at a national park, the first level of command is the Park Police, and then it goes to the feds, and then the local police are somehow tangentially involved. We've certainly seen that when crimes have been committed in San Francisco in the Golden Gate recreation area, which, except like Ocean Beach, for example, in San Francisco, is not San Francisco at all. It's National Park Service land. So if you get killed in Ocean Beach, you're not going to have SFPD out there first. It's going to be Park Police. So keep that in mind if you're getting killed in San Francisco. So like, I feel like anytime you have interjurisdictional stuff like that, you're going to Julian's excellent point, have good investigators who are doing their best but inevitably connections are going to be missed, just as we all see in our jobs, like interdepartmental, like poor communication.
I mean, that makes sense. All right. We talk about the numerous things that happened to Crater Lake. The one that I found really interesting in the course of this is a photographer named Eve Batey, who was, I think aspired to Ansel Adams type nature photography. And he was photographing Crater Lake, camping and photographing Crater Lake in 1911, I believe, and went missing. All that was found was his campsite and his equipment. And so we're going to share a link with you guys just of his work at Crater Lake, which is really interesting. But there are also a number of, really, if you Google Crater Lake, the first stuff that comes up is just how weird, wild, curious, mysterious it is. Yeah. Do you guys have any favorites of the lore of Crater Lake? And why do you think that is? Is this the Bermuda Triangle of Oregon?
I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think people would like it to be, because it is one of the most unique spots, natural spots in the Northwest. I think in the West Coast, honestly. It's like nowhere else. So what do you think, you?
Well, I mean, my favorite is the guy that officials say sort of melted, that they just sort of found tiny bits of him. I'm really curious about that. Like, is the argument there? I don't know enough about Crater Lake. Is there volcanic activity? Is there, is this a Grand Canyon thing, like a hot thing? I don't know. Melting people is interesting to me. Maybe I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark at the wrong age.
Someone asks, actually specific to the 1952 double murder. Lisa wants to know, was it a warm day when this occurred? I know it was around 1 or 2 in the afternoon.
It was. It was in the middle of summer at the peak of the tourist season. And it was a beautiful sunny day.
All right, Lisa, if you have a clue, please email us, because we definitely, if Alta can solve this, we'll be pretty psyched. Okay, but moving on, I wanted, Eve, I want to kind of touch on true crime with you, because I know that, for years, you and I, Eve is a very good friend of mine, but you and I have kind of discussed cold cases and true crimes. And yet in recent years, the genre has exploded, and I don't think that's an overstatement, in popularity through podcasts, through film, the Making of a Murderer on Netflix, serial podcasts, stuff like that. Why do you think that is? You do a daily newsletter on true crime now.
Well, and more specifically, Best Evidence is focused on how true crime is told and sold. So we're not just about like, hey, there's crimes that happens. We're about the rise in sort of the pop culture phenomenon that is true crime. So I can tell you firsthand, there is, my Google alerts, which at one time were 1 or 2 items, now are like pages upon pages of stuff, with the term true crime. Well, my theory, and this is just a theory, is that this is a side effect of what people refer to as mean world syndrome. So mean world syndrome, the psychological phenomenon, which you may or may not believe in, it's up to you, is that when we have access to more information on negative things, I'll give you the examples of like nextdoor.com or the Citizen app, or even, sending around things on Facebook, the greater the perception is that these things take place. A great example is that right now people say, oh, crime in San Francisco is so high, it's so unbelievable. It's actually far lower than it was in the 90s and the early 2000s. But now that we have these things like Nextdoor and Citizen and Facebook, we're far more aware of every single car break-in. So in a lot of ways, I sometimes wonder if our interest in true crime is not partially fueled by our internalizing that mean world stuff, that, holy cow, I can't step outside the house without someone stealing my Amazon delivery. And that true crime gives us more of a sense of organization. This is the story. This is what happened. This was how it was investigated. And if this isn't how it was investigated, here's a great Reddit forum you can go to help investigate it. So that's my theory, because I think that in the end, most humans want an organized answer for everything. That's why we have religion. That's why we have QAnon. We all just want answers, and I think that true crime gives it to us.
See, one of the reasons that it attracts me to it is that I go through a case like this. If I were, one of the victims of this case, what would I have done differently? And I redo it all in my head. If I were Jones and Kulain, am I right? How could I have prevented this from happening? I take it back in time and redo it all so that everyone lives happily ever after. Julian, we have a couple of more questions about the victims. Maureen would like to know, what was their background, their occupation, where did they live?
They were from Central Oregon, and they were in the automotive parts business. They were, taking the other two guys were meeting. They were all meeting for the first time, where the auto parts folks, kind of make the rounds of the different states and, tell you about what's new in Chevrolets this year. So that was the background of all these guys.
So theoretically, they all, just to understand this social arrangement, 4 guys, all of whom worked in like auto parts industries, and one of their 13-year-old sons, there was a child along.
Yes.
Decide, let's take this Saturday afternoon. Oh, it was a Saturday. See, the suits doesn't make sense to me, but maybe in the 50s, everyone wore suits. I don't know. Yeah. They decide to take this afternoon and meet up in 2 cars. We're going to take Jones' car. You guys take the Eberlein's car. Mm-hmm. And that was the plan. We're just going to go meet up at Crater Lake and hang out for the afternoon.
One of the guys had a cabin up there, and they were, one of them hadn't ever been to Crater Lake. One of the guys that came from out of state, and I forget whether it was Jones or Kulain, actually had a cabin. And so kind of at the last minute, he said, hey, why don't we go up to Crater Lake, do some fishing. We'll show you how gorgeous it is. And so that was the original plan. And I think they did some work that morning, which might've been why they were wearing their suits. But, also it was the 50s. So that could explain it too.
Everyone was overdressed in the 1950s. And Rosalie, so if it was a warm day, how were there no witnesses? All right, let's talk about the weird witness moment.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was around noon, the peak tourist season. And yeah, apparently at first they didn't think there were any witnesses, but then a guy came forward a few years later named Lincoln Lenz. And he has this crazy story where he says he was driving deliveries for the park on the road that day, going from one lodge to the other. And he says, as he drove by that spot, he saw 4 guys, 2 leading 2 other ones into the woods. And one of the ones that was being led into the woods, which would be Jones or Kulain, kind of made a gesture like a gun, almost like he was trying to get away with saying, hey, these guys have guns here. This is not what we want to do. And then his story goes on, and it's long and detailed about how he kept bumping into the 2 men who were leading these guys into the woods, who, you would think would be the killers. He kept bumping into them a few other times over the next day or 2. And they would give him really dirty looks once they kind of pulled in front of him and didn't let him pull out. And he had, really detailed descriptions of these guys. And he went to the police, and apparently they just blew him off. They didn't even believe him.
And one of the suspects was missing a finger.
Yes, one of the suspects was missing a finger.
And Lincoln Lenz happened to be missing the very same finger.
Mm-hmm.
And Lincoln has kind of since passed. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the things with crimes that happened in 1952 is not a lot of the people involved are still alive. But he, I mean, from what I can tell in the research that's kind of come to me since Alta published Julian's story, is that he tried to kind of stay involved in this case for years, decades afterwards. Is that a thing where people are attracted or want to involve themselves in true crime cases? I mean, I kind of have that sense of, oh boy, I would have loved to be a witness, to participate, to see if I can help solve it. I mean, I wanted to help solve this case.
People admit to crimes they didn't do just to be famous sometimes.
We have a very weird way of kind of looking at crimes. Okay, I want to get specific with you guys. if we're placing bets, the three of us, or anyone who's watching today, are placing bets, who do we think did it?
I know who I'm betting against. I'm betting against the Mountain Mob. I don't think they did it because I don't think that there was any reason for them not to admit it, and for the feds who were interrogating them not to push them to confess prior to their execution at San Quentin. I mean, I think that it's sort of a known thing that shortly before you're executed, the feds come and sort of ask you, did you kill anybody else? Is there anything else we need to clear up? And of course, that's part of their jobs as investigators, but also, once again, I mean, I think that we always have to remember that this is a job. This is a job like any of our jobs. If you can clear cases, it looks good. They are, investigators are incentivized to find answers to these questions. I understand that Mrs. Sims was dissatisfied and said, well, they wouldn't want to muddy the waters since these guys were up for execution, but that's not how it works. That wouldn't have been muddying the waters. That would have been making those feds' lives easier, so that they couldn't get a confession from those guys at that point or convince them to for any sort of reason at all, suggests to me that they really didn't do it.
So who do you think did it?
Nobody that's even in our narrative. Some other rando.
Okay. What about you, Julian?
I'm not sure, but I think Alice makes a pretty convincing case of these two members of this group that was called the Mountain Murder Mob that committed a whole string of really horrific crimes up and down the West Coast around the same time. There was, it's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but there's things like they had connections to the area. At least some of the gang was actually placed in the area at that time. Although one of them was placed down in California, so it's not black and white. The MO of the crime was exactly what they did to people. They would, kind of blitz them, rob them, and often kill them. And the fact that they were on the FBI's radar, and as again, the FBI tried to get a last-minute confession out of them as they were waiting on death row for an even more horrific crime of killing a father and a whole bunch of kids. And, I'm wondering if it was that deny up to the end thing. Maybe they were hoping for a last minute stay of execution and they didn't want to dig themselves even deeper at the very last minute. But, Alice says she's 99.9% sure it was these guys. And I haven't heard any better suggestions. So.
Is there any, in terms of the evidence, is there anything with DNA?
That's also interesting because obviously they didn't have DNA back in the 50s.
Right.
And one of Alice and Dave's hopes is that they can get the case reopened and do some DNA analysis of any physical evidence that's left behind. And I'm not sure what the procedure is to actually have that happen, but especially Dave, he keeps mentioning that over and over. Especially, recently, all these advances in DNA technology, they can look people up in these huge online, 23andMe databases and make connections. They've actually found killers that way, where they make a connection with your, second cousin who happens to be on 23andMe or any of those websites, and they make a connection that way. So I don't know what physical evidence is still around, how contaminated it would be, but there's got to be some, and maybe that is an option that could happen.
It's in like a cardboard box somewhere.
Probably in Portland, I think.
Okay, well, you're in Portland, Julian, so. Lisa asks, when a violent crime occurs at a tourist destination or scenic spot, does that add or detract from its future appeal?
According to people at the Grand Canyon, people are drawn to those spots after something like that occurs. This is something that I actually asked about the last time I was there. And people have apparently said similar things about spots in Yellowstone.
There's actually a series of books all about deaths in national parks. So, it's like deaths in the Grand Canyon, deaths in Yellowstone. All the gift shops of the big parks have those. It's a great idea.
There's actually, for those, I will link to this as well. There's a podcast devoted specifically to, I'll find it and link to it in the email. Park Predators, that's what it's called. And it is a podcast. Each episode is about a different crime that occurred in a national park or a state park. Again, the true crime explosion. All right, we are just about out of time. So I've got one last question for both of you. Julian, I will start with you. For those that loved this article, or loved is the wrong word when we're talking about murder, but were intrigued by this article, can you name another West Coast cold case that we might be interested in diving into?
I've been recently looking into one. It was a train robbery that happened in Southern Oregon in 1923. And it was a brutal thing where they stopped the train in a tunnel. They blew open the mail car, ended up killing 4 people in cold blood and running off into the woods. And the way they solved that one, it was one of the very first applications of forensic science in the country. And they got a local chemistry teacher, I think, to look at a lot of the evidence that these guys left behind. And he was able to deduce, like, for example, they had a coat, and he was able to figure out, because of the particular pine stains on the coat, that the guy was probably a logger. And from the way the buttons were worn, he was probably left-handed. And they put a lot of these physical evidence clues together. It was one of the first times they used airplanes to search for folks. And they finally narrowed it down to these 3 brothers and put them away for life. So that's what I've been looking into recently.
And where was it exactly? I'm gonna have to link.
It was in the Siskiyou National Forest, which is down in Southern Oregon.
Okay. Nassim, our editorial assistant, she's like getting me links for this as we go. Okay, Eve, we have one more good question, but okay, Eve, what's your case, a West Coast case that would interest us if we're interested?
Well, I think that the Doodler is a fascinating case. And it's frustrating, I think, for people who love to consume true crime content, though, because there is not a ton out there. And the reason is because it was a mid-70s San Francisco, and the victims were primarily young gay guys. And back then, I know you don't believe it, guys, but San Francisco at one time was not friendly to gay folks. And police refused in many cases to investigate the missing persons reports. One of the things that might make it a little more star-studded for you, though, is one of Hollywood's biggest stars who would come up to San Francisco to party with boys was one of the Doodler's victims who managed to escape. And there are many sort of thoughts on who this person actually was, and I won't get Alta sued, but if you read, there's a 2014 story in the All called The Untold Story of the Doodler Murders, which is one of the most comprehensive stories on the case, and one of the first times someone really tackled it. It will name some names. I know you said, Beth, that somebody has written about the Doodler for Alta in recent years.
Yeah, it's one of our cold cases, Zach Ruskin.
Yeah, the Doodler sort of came back into prominence because just a couple of years ago, SFPD said that they had more evidence on the case, but then didn't really say anything else. So it's unclear where it went. It's possible that the evidence they had was, to Julian's earlier point, there is actually only one database that is usable for that DNA evidence that we've been talking about, that sort of the self-reported DNA evidence. Companies like 23andMe are actually very focused on privacy, or so they claim. So there is only one database, and it's the same database that was used to catch like the Golden State killer. So there was supposedly some DNA evidence that came up from this one single database. And but then it really never went anywhere. The San Francisco Chronicle is doing a podcast on it that's supposed to launch sometime this year. So I'm really psyched to hear that. But it's a case that has bothered me for years. And so I urge everyone else to be bothered with me.
And the Chronicle podcast that's coming up, I am also very excited for. It's going to be feature Kevin Fagan, who's the Chronicle's crime reporter and kind of the Chronicle's resident Zodiac expert. When the weird mail comes in for Zodiac, it goes to Kevin, which I find very interesting about Kevin. Okay, actually, I'm going to squeeze in time for one last question because our crowd is not leaving us yet. And it's a two-parter, one for each of you. Julian, this Mito asks, Julian, would love to hear your thoughts on the line between literary nonfiction and investigative journalism.
That's an interesting one because I only do literary nonfiction, and this is really my first crime story. And I don't know, maybe Eve is better posed to answer this, but I just, what I think the line is between simply writing about something and writing about what's out there and finding new stuff and getting into it, getting almost personally involved in it that way.
He's investigating.
I couldn't answer it better.
And then Eve, for you, Eve, would love to hear your thoughts on whether, beyond facts, the tone of a piece on the incident can draw you in or put you off.
Well, who here has watched Nancy Grace? I think that there's some, some sort of obvious no does. Anything that, and I don't know, maybe it's not an obvious no duh because you'll still see it sometimes these days. Anything that sort of suggests that the victim is to blame. And I'm not talking about like mob hits or something like that. I'm talking about stranger crimes, things like that, where it's like, well, she was out after 10:30, things like that. Obviously I'm out, that's vile. But also I myself am uncomfortable around propaganda, around narratives where the police are not questioned themselves, and when there are cases where there perhaps are issues with how the police handle things. That's one of like the nice things, that Mrs. Sims wasn't just, well, here's what the cops said, I guess we're all done. I think that, that's something that we as a society, obviously, all know that we can't just take everything that the police tell us for granted, just like we can't take what anybody tells us for granted. So anytime I see sort of a true crime property that's like, here's what the cop says, guess we're done. This podcast sponsored by Crime Stoppers of Indianapolis, I'm not into it.
I wonder which podcast you're talking about.
Well, I'm from Indianapolis, so it could be all sorts of them, Beth.
Okay, with that, I'm gonna wrap it up. Again, folks, I've got a little housekeeping to do while I let Julian and Eve off the hook here. I want to thank everyone again for tuning in. If you are late to any part of this event or want to share it with everyone you know, we will have the entire conversation up on our website a little later today. And again, you've registered for this event, so I'm going to shoot you an email with links to all sorts of the stuff we talked about today. Our fabulous, Alta's fabulous editorial assistant, Naseem, has been jotting all of this down. We've got the links ready to go to you guys. Next week, we're going to switch gears and welcome Alta contributor Ishmael Reed and blues musician and conservationist Ronnie Stewart for a discussion on the past, present, and future of Oakland's blues scene, which will be really excited. And they have suggested they might be willing to sing a duet for us. That's going to be on Wednesday, February 17th at 12:30. And again, I'll include details in that email I'm going to send you. A very big thank you to Julian and Eve for this, what I found to be a really fun and informative discussion. And again, to our audience, thank you so much for taking the time today, for showing up, for spending your lunch 45 minutes with us. We're grateful to you. So stay safe, everyone. And again, take care. Goodbye. Thanks.
Thanks for coming.
Hand this. And